Well, it's hard to give much of a review because that was a review, a rather brief one, of his career during the war. Last night we dealt with the Articles of Confederation and with George Washington. George Washington, during the War of Independence, had a very difficult time because so many Americans were not interested in fighting, and almost single-handed, he was the rallying force and the moving power that led to independence. There were many men who were ready to talk a very heroic line, but when it came to action, they were not in the least ready to be there. Now, one of the things that George Washington suffered from a great deal during the war was the problem of the impotence of Congress to do anything. And the fact that in Congress the men were more often motivated by petty personal interests, state jealousies, and failed to appreciate what the Army was going through. This led to a great deal of bitterness on the part of many of the officers. In the case of one very fine officer of a very great record, who had been one of the heroes of the war up until that point, it led him in bitterness to feel there was no future with such an inept group of people as Congress represented. That was Benedict Arnold. Because his wife was already pro-British, she harped endlessly on how he was being mistreated by Congress, how they were making political promotions rather than recognizing his work, and she persuaded him because of this to defect. Now his fellow officers who remained faithful to the cause were naturally very bitter at Benedict Arnold's defection, but they could understand how he was moved to it, because Congress was indeed an impotent and a futile thing. Now, one of the problems, of course, with Congress was that very often it lacked superior men. It was so weak under the Articles of Confederation that, after all, if you were an outstanding Virginian, you would prefer to remain in Virginia and to be active in the state government rather than to go to Congress and to be active in the national or the federal government of the Articles of Confederation. The result was that too often the men who were in Congress were not the men of the kind of ability a crisis so great required. This in itself posed a problem. Where the best leadership was needed, it was often lacking. This does not mean that all the men in the Continental Congress were incompetent. There were some very, very able men, John Witherspoon for one. But theirs was a frustrating work precisely because there was no great respect for Congress because of its weakness, and too many of the men who came were, like Congress, weak men. We saw that Congress had no power to tax under the Articles of Confederation. But second, it did have the power to borrow money and issue paper money. And this was a deadly power. The states were ready to say, well, we won't give Congress any money. Let them issue paper money or borrow money. Third, Congress or the government of the United States under the Articles of Confederation could make no amendment to the Articles without a 100% vote of every state. This meant any one state that disagreed had an absolute veto. Well, of course, it was impossible to do anything to improve the Articles under that. If any one state could veto the Articles and say, the amendment, and say we will not have this amendment, that was the end of it. And so it was useless even to try to amend the Articles. This is why, when the Constitutional Convention was called, they didn't even think about amending the Articles. It was useless. You could not get unanimity. Then, fourth, because the Continental Congress was so weak in its powers, very often the men who would be named by Massachusetts or Virginia or Pennsylvania or Georgia to attend as the delegates did not bother to attend, so that there were periods when Congress lacked a quorum, and so in effect no United States existed. Washington and the other men were apparently soldiers under Congress, and Congress did not actually exist. There was no quorum. Now this, of course, especially in wartime, creates a real crisis. You have a government that cannot operate, first because it's weak, and second because it doesn't even have a quorum. A quorum, incidentally, means enough members present to constitute a legal meeting. Then fifth, there was no executive branch. Sixth, no judiciary, so there was no way of penalizing anyone who violated the laws of the Union. In other words, the Articles of Confederation gave a very weak government. This is why it was Washington who led the move for a new Constitution. Now, some of the radical writers, especially the Marxists, try to make out that the people fought for the freedom they had, and then a group of reactionaries shoved the Constitution down their throats. And you will get this in most colleges and universities. This is rubbish. It was the men who fought who also were responsible for the new government of the Constitution of 1787, our Constitution. It was Washington, the commander-in-chief, who took the lead in seeing to it that there was a new Constitution. It was Washington who presided at the Constitutional Convention. Now, it is true that the Constitutional Convention met in secret. It was not that the public did not know they were meeting, but they had been called together to try to improve the government of the United States according to the Articles of Confederation. But Washington and others who were in on that call realized very quickly this is useless. You cannot improve a government where one state can veto what you do. It's impossible. We cannot amend or alter the Articles. We have to start and propose an entirely new Constitution to replace the old Articles, and only then do we have a chance of establishing a strong government. As a result, they kept their deliberations secret. They did not want the states saying to the delegates, come back home. We don't want you involved in something like this, which would have been quite likely had the news leaked out. They wanted first to be able to complete their work and then to say to the states, here is the new Constitution. Consider it. Give it a fair trial, a fair hearing. So this is what they did. The preamble of the Constitution declares, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. They deliberately, you see, bypassed the articles in which it was we, the states, coming together to do this. They went to the people. We, the people of the United States. They did this because they felt that the only way they could create a government sufficiently strong to take care of the problems that existed was by grounding it not simply in the states, but in more than the states. The states, indeed, were going to have representation by states rather than population in the Senate. But they also needed to ground it in the people themselves. And so they said, we the people. Then it's very common in public schools for teachers and in colleges that are non-Christian to ridicule the second clause in order to form a more perfect union. How can you be more perfect than perfect? And they think, of course, they're saying, in effect, you see, these people didn't even have good grammar here. Well, of course, if you use perfect in a modern sense, you cannot say more perfect. Because perfect is as good as you can get. But words change their meaning. The word, for example, silly, has changed its meaning in English over the generations. If, for example, in Chaucer's day or thereafter, for a couple of centuries, you had spoken of your girlfriend or your boyfriend, or a man spoke of his wife as silly, it would not be an insult. It would mean dear, beloved. Now try calling someone silly, and they aren't going to take it as a compliment. You see, the word has gradually changed its meaning. Moreover, another example of a word changing its meaning is farmer. It once meant tax collector. And the word stink. Now, today, when you use the word stink, it means a bad smell. But once stink did not mean a bad smell, you could say to someone, you stink beautifully. And it would be legitimate, you see. Words usually go downhill in their meaning, unfortunately, which says something about human nature, doesn't it? Now, perfect once meant mature. And in the King James Version of the Bible, this is what perfect usually means, mature. So, what the preamble is saying is, in order to form a more mature union, something better able to cope with problems. The Articles were in effect an immature document. Now we want a more mature document. Then, a little later, the preamble says, to provide for the common defense. You know, of the 13 colonies, only 2 paid their full proportion of the costs of the war. They were New York and Pennsylvania. How can you provide for the common defense if Congress has no taxing power? You can see from this what a problem Washington had. Congress was not getting any money from the states, or very little. And only New York and Pennsylvania finally paid up. Then to promote the general welfare. This meant only the individual's freedom from public restraint. Because they go on and say, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Now, as we come to the Constitution itself, the main body of it, of course you all know that the Constitution provides for 3 equal branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. No supremacy, according to the Constitution, was given to any one branch. Thus, whereas the Articles of Confederation had only one branch, Congress, now 3 branches were created. Their reason for this was they knew they were creating a strong government. They knew, moreover, this would be the most serious criticism of the Constitution. There would be many who would be seriously afraid of it and against it because they would feel it was creating too strong a government. This was the objection of Patrick Henry, and this was the objection of George Mason. So 2 of the greatest Americans, apart from George Washington, opposed the Constitution because they felt it created too strong a federal government. Mason opposed the Constitution, although he was in the Constitutional Convention and had a great deal to do with the writing of it, because it gave too vague a power, too general a power to Congress over interstate commerce, and because it did not deal with the issue of slavery. You see, what happened was the Southerners told the New Englanders, keep your hands off of slavery and we'll keep our hands off the issue of commerce. And so they made a deal. And Mason was very bitter about this deal, and he left and went home. And of course he was right. That deal led to the Civil War, and it led to the ability of the federal government to this day to interfere in the various states in the name of controlling interstate commerce. Now, the reason for creating 3 equal branches was to use each as a check on the other. The idea of checks and balances. Now, checks and balances was very definitely a religious idea. It implied a distrust of man, a belief that man is a sinner and cannot be trusted with too much power. As a matter of fact, there is a very interesting statement which I neglected to mark out so that I could read to you. But in essence, what one of the men in the Constitutional Convention said when they were trying to sell the people on the idea of a Constitution, he said, if all men were angels, we would need no Constitution. And if all our officials were angels, we would need no Constitution. But since it is not likely that either the people or the officials are going to be angels, we need, therefore, checks and balances and very real restraints upon power. In other words, they were emphatically affirming their belief that man is a sinner. Now, as we begin our analysis of Article 1 of the Constitution, the first thing that is apparent is that we have here 2 doctrines of American constitutional law. First, our government is one of delegated power. Delegated powers. In other words, the Constitution says the government has no power in and of itself. Its powers are delegated. And second, Congress cannot delegate its legislative powers to anyone else. All legislative power herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. Now, if we followed this, we today would not have all the commissions that govern, because many of our commissions do, in effect, today have legislative powers. In terms of what the Founding Fathers believed, the present-day commissions and various groups that have legislative powers in effect are unconstitutional. The various rules and regulations that the Internal Revenue issues would be unconstitutional, because legislative powers are reserved to Congress and they cannot be delegated. If Congress could delegate these powers, then the principle of the separation of powers is, of course, destroyed. Moreover, in Section 2 of Article 1, in dealing with the House of Representatives, the Founding Fathers decided to keep as much power close to those who represented the people rather than the states, so that the power of impeachment was vested in the House. The trial of impeachment is by the Senate. In other words, if Congress wants to impeach a president or any official, only the House of Representatives can issue the bill of impeachment or of indictment. Then the Senate, which represents the states, the House the people, the Senate the states, the Senate can try him. Moreover, the House of Representatives, which represents the people, is the only source of tax bills. So that while tax bills have to be approved by both the House, the Senate, and the President, only the House can institute a tax bill. Now, the Senate can make amendments to it and suggestions, but any they make have to go back to the House to be approved. On the other hand, the Senate represents the states. 2 senators from each state, irrespective of the size of the state. At that time, we saw last night, the states varied in size from Virginia, with the most population, 400,000, to Georgia, with about 25,000. Now, Georgia was only about a 16th the size of Virginia in population, but it still had 2 senators, just as Virginia did. In other words, there was an equal representation by the states. This is the most difficult thing in the entire Constitution to change. As we shall see later on, the Constitution specifies this Constitution of the Senate cannot be changed except by a unanimous vote of every state in the Union. I don't think that's ever likely. Can you imagine, say, Nevada ever voting itself out of 2 senators so California can have, say, 10 or 15 senators by comparison? It's not likely. It's highly unlikely. And as a result, the most unchangeable aspect of the entire Constitution is precisely that. in Article 1, Section 5, it says of Congress, each House may determine the rules for its proceedings, punish its members for disorderly behavior, and with the concurrence of 2/3, expel a member. Now this is a very important fact. In the Articles of Confederation, as you recall, we mentioned earlier, a lack of quorum constituted a major problem. Meeting after meeting called of Congress and not enough people to make it a legal meeting. Well, when you have this kind of situation, how can you transact business? And another factor, very often when meetings are called by various groups, there is something very, very controversial. And some people want to duck a meeting. Now, just as sometimes school children try to get sick when they know there's a bad test and they're not ready for it, it's convenient to somehow get sick on that day if they can get away with it. Well, there are times in the history of organizations, in the history of presbyteries and various church bodies, and in the history of a Congress where it is difficult for a congressman or a senator to go without knowing, I'm on the spot. Everyone back home is going to be watching to see how I vote, and I'm going to be clobbered if I vote this way, and I'm going to be clobbered if I vote that way. Now, because each house has the right to discipline its members for non-attendance and for any kind of contempt, Congress can compel that they be present. This power has rarely been invoked, but it has been invoked on a few occasions. It is an important power because it does mean that people cannot duck out on their responsibilities. Then, as we go on to Section 7 of Article 1, we find that the House was not only the source, is not only the source of all revenue or tax bills, and also the source of any impeachment. The Senate, on the other hand, may propose amendments to the Constitution, so that the states have the right to come and say, we feel that the Constitution requires amendment. And of course, the proposed constitutional amendment normally goes to all the states for ratification. Now, in Section 8, where the powers of Congress are given, we have some very difficult and controversial passages. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. In other words, Virginia cannot say, we don't want Pennsylvania goods coming into the state, so we'll discriminate against anything that is from Pennsylvania. This is forbidden. However, it is in the next paragraph that the difficulty comes in. To borrow money on the credit of the United States. Now, this is a dangerous clause, because when a government has the power to borrow money, it can, in effect, even when it has a gold currency, as we were supposed to have in the beginning, inflate the currency by borrowing. And so the borrowing power is a very dangerous one. And this has created problems over the years. Then, in the next clause, it begins to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and a foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures, to provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities and current coin of the United States. Now, yesterday I called attention to the fact that all kinds of monies were legal tender in the United States, as long as they were gold and silver. You could go in those days and pay your taxes or go to a shop and pull out some silver and gold coins that were French or English or Spanish or Dutch or whatever country you wanted, and you could buy whatever you wanted. Why? Because gold and silver were alone legal tender, alone legal money. And every storekeeper, as well as the tax collector, had a table establishing the weight of the coin. When we issued a trade dollar, we actually put on that trade dollar the number of grains of silver in it. Now that trade dollar was for our merchants when they sailed to China and to the Indies and to India to use in trading with those countries. Now, one of your problems, if you do any traveling, is trying to figure out how to change money in different countries. Well, the Americans, since they had so many currencies, knew at that time the value of the sovereign and of the shilling and of the guilder and franc in American money in terms of the dollar. But they recognized that, well, when we are going to China, for example, the Chinese don't necessarily know what a dollar means. So we will write on the coin the actual number of grains of silver in this coin. Now, this was how they conceived of money, by weight, actual weight of gold and silver, so that the power given to Congress was to coin money. Now, they deliberately used this word because they were afraid of paper money. They had seen what had happened to the continental dollar, the continental paper money, just a few years before. The last thing they wanted was any more trouble with paper money. And so, they emphatically wrote in that the power to coin money alone was legitimate. Now, Congress was not given the exclusive power to coin money. That came only in the last 100 years. So that for the first 100 years of the Republic, anyone could coin money, provided he coined money in terms of gold and silver and made it an actual weight. Now, what was the advantage in this? Well, to give you an idea of what coined money was worth, the double eagle, the United States $20 gold piece, had about $19.20 in gold in it. Now, the other 80 cents was what it cost the United States to mint the money, and its seigniorage, its profit for doing it, which was legitimate. When we had silver quarters, I don't know, well, that was before any of you could remember, probably, but how many of you have seen or have a silver quarter? Good. They're good to have. Now, the silver quarter had 23 cents worth of silver in it when silver was $1.19 an ounce. Of course, the silver now is worth something like $3.05 an ounce, and it's probably more today. So that quarter is now worth about 75 cents just in its silver content. But when you had this small a difference, a man who was mining gold and silver, if he were a very capable man, could take and make coins, good coins, and circulate them. He made a small profit on them, and people would accept them, the government would accept them as taxes, and there was no problem. A great deal of such coinage was made from the colonial period to almost 100 years ago. I'm not sure of the date. I did know it, but I've forgotten it. It was something like 1876 or 1881, thereabouts, when they finally abolished the right of private minting. A great deal of privately coined gold, in particular, was issued after the California gold rush. So the Constitution did not say the United States was the only one who could mint money, but the only kind of money, according to the Constitution, that could be issued was coined money. Regulate the value thereof. To specify how many grains of gold had to go into a gold dollar and how many into a silver dollar. And of foreign coins. To set up the tables whereby the tax collector could say that there was so much in the way of grains of gold and silver in a guilder or a franc or a sovereign, and fix the standard of weights and measures. Now this means primarily the weights and measures of gold, but also the weights and measures such as bushels, pounds, and so on, to provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities and current coin of the United States. Then the next clause is another one that has been very controversial, and it has been also rather dangerous. Oh, I didn't see that the time had passed. Excuse me. We'll take a 5-minute break while some of you go to your classes.